Wonderful. Well, welcome again to Target Test Prep's webinar on building a personal brand for MBA admissions. I am your guide this evening. My name is Joanna Graham. I am an MBA expert coach with Target Test Prep. I've worked in the admissions and in the higher ed and standardized testing space for over 20 years. I spent about a decade working at the Graduate Management Admission Council, where I oversaw GMAT testing operations, which is really just a fancy way of saying I was the product manager for the GMAT for several years. And worked both on the test development as well as on the test operations side of the business. In addition to that, I've also read applications at Georgetown as well as a handful of other universities. I have been coaching applicants and supporting them on their business school journeys, as well as undergrad applicants for over 20 years. So I'm delighted to be joining you tonight. In my spare time, I've also dabbled in marketing and product branding, and so for any of you who do work in marketing, a lot of this will probably sound fairly familiar to you all. But really, I think that when you start thinking about business school, when you start thinking about what goes into building a profile, or really for all intents and purposes, a brand, this really is a great exercise in branding and product market fit. So I hope you find tonight's session to be valuable. Just a quick word about Target Test Prep. So in addition to admissions consulting, Target Test Prep is, as the name might suggest, actually started off as a test prep company. So I did want to mention, if folks, depending on where you are in the process, if you are interested in GMAT or GRE prep, we do offer a variety of self-study courses, live courses, as well as private tutoring. So I'd encourage you to visit our website, targettestprep.com, where you can learn a bit more about our test prep services. Admissions consulting is a newer offering. We launched admissions consulting last year, really as a result from popular demand from our clients. As I mentioned, I have over 2 decades of experience in the space, and have been excited to join the team at TTP and to spearhead our admissions work. And again, you'll be able to learn a little bit more about the various packages and services that we do offer, and I'll touch on those just a little bit more at the end of tonight's session as well. So let's, at the risk of making this a marketing lecture, I always like to start off with a broader question. So when you think about brands, what is a brand? And so I would love to kind of get to folks' thoughts. Feel free to drop those in the chat. When you think about a brand, or maybe a memorable brand, what do you think of when you start thinking about brands themselves? And obviously you can see a handful of logos here, a couple of taglines, but when you start thinking about brands, what makes them memorable? What stands out to you? Oh, and apologies, I see a couple of notes here that it looks like folks can't get out of direct message. So definitely feel free to drop those notes in the chat, and then we'll certainly do the best that we can this evening. So I definitely see some notes here about brands, brands being logos, being taglines. They're how people make you feel. I think on the heels of the Super Bowl, obviously there are probably a lot of brands that are standing out to folks. I'll ask you a slightly different question. So when you take a look at this, and again, feel free to drop this in the chat. What do you think? What do folks start thinking about when they see this image? I suppose depending on which part of the world you are in, it might either be decaffeinated or regular coffee, or maybe even hot chocolate. I'm getting some folks who are saying they think about energy. They're thinking about about waking up in the morning, a generic cup of mediocre office coffee, Starbucks, Dunkin' Donuts, a means to an end. I don't know if any of you have tiny humans running around your house. I do, and so the first thing I think of when I see this is, oh my gosh, this is basically what I need to get me moving in the morning. So now let's take a look at what happens now when we actually throw a logo on this. And so now, what do folks start thinking about, or what do folks feel when they see a logo? Now, it's probably familiar to just about everyone. All right, fantastic. So I'm seeing things like loyalty, very expensive, West Coast. What about Dunkin' Donuts? So yes, depending on where you are in the country, you might be asking, well, what about Blue Bottle? What about Dunkin' Donuts? For any of my Canadian friends, what about Tim Hortons? Convenience, overpriced. Yes, it definitely runs the gamut. I think what I would like to point out going through this exercise is that, again, good brands are going to evoke some type of reaction, some type of emotional reaction or visceral reaction sometimes from consumers. And Whether or not it's a positive or a negative thing or a good or bad thing, it's not as relevant as the fact that it is creating some type of reaction. People react to brands. And this is one of the things you want to start thinking about is you start thinking about what is your personal brand. And it's good to sort of take stock of your personal brand and what that actually means at various points in your life, at various points in your career. And so this will be something that we talk about tonight when we start thinking about you as individuals, as having a personal brand. But this is a great way to start, again, just recognize the fact that good brands, being a good brand doesn't necessarily mean that everybody loves you or that everybody hates you, but it is creating some type of visceral or emotional response or reaction. So when we think about brands, brands are, like I said, really what people think about a product, service, or organization. And I'll be honest, I think that some of the brands here that are listed with some of these, listed with some of these emotions and reactions might be a tad dated. But by and large, when you look at these brands, they align fairly well with the sentiment that's attached here. And again, for better or worse, a lot of these brands I think have done a very good job of curating and creating an aura and a reaction that aligns very much with this type of sentiment. One of the challenges, though, with brands is that we are bombarded with just so much content. I made a reference to the Super Bowl a little bit earlier, and I think that's a great example. You know, one of the best things about the morning after the Super Bowl is, you know, well, I guess for folks who are in an office or for folks who have, I guess, some, you know, Slack water cooler chatter. It's always fun to talk about, you know, what were the most memorable commercials. But you know, as someone who's worked in marketing for over 2 decades, I think one of my biggest questions for folks is always, it's not so much about which commercials were memorable, but do you actually remember what any of them were trying to sell you? And I think it's really telling when you talk about, you know, when you talk about an event that has so many eyeballs on it, and you're talking about $7 million for a 30-second ad. All of these companies are going to great lengths to curate a story, to curate a brand, to evoke emotion from people. And for all intents and purposes, most of them are going to be forgotten in, you know, in just a couple of days, if not the morning after. And so, you know, one of the things that I encourage folks to think about is, you know, why is there so much noise? Why do we have such a short attention span? And if you think about some of these platforms, you know, TikTok has over 1 billion users worldwide. When you think about Instagram, when you think about the World Wide Web, you've got over 3 billion images and videos that are being shared and uploaded daily. You have over 95 million photos that are uploaded to Instagram alone on a daily basis. And in fact, you know, when you think about websites, there are over 1.3 billion websites on the internet, but only a small fraction, only about 200 million of those are actually active websites. And then I included the cat and the loaf of bread. Because, you know, again, it seems like every week there's some new viral thing that is going around on social media. So whether it be pictures of cats in sandwich bread or whatever the latest, you know, whatever the latest and greatest may be, we do tend to have a really short memory. And so one of the things as you start thinking about brands, you know, what this really means is that you've got to think about how to remain relevant and how to remain or how to be memorable. But again, without sort of pushing the envelope a little bit too far. One of the things to also think about as you're thinking about your own personal brand here is that, you know, as you've kind of gone out and started building your careers and your curating experiences since you've graduated from college, you probably have become somewhat comfortable in sort of the pond that you're swimming in. And if you think about the different ponds or concentric circles that you've lived in throughout your life, high school was probably one, college was one, your professional life now is one. And at some point, you probably felt like a reasonably sized fish in a pretty small pond. As you start thinking about business school and beyond, this is another concentric circle or another pond, basically, to continue that metaphor that you're going to be moving into. And so it's important to think about how do you stand out? How do you differentiate yourself from their competition that's going to be migrating to that pond as well, or that concentric circle? Um, you know, when you think about brands, so we've talked a little bit about companies and products and services, but when you actually start thinking about personal brands, I do like to throw in a couple of actual real people. And so, again, I'll toss this out to the group here. You have thoughts on some of the folks up on these slides? I think all of these folks come from a variety of different industries, but have done a really good job of curating not only singular brands, but in many cases, multiple iterations and multiple versions of brands as well. So feel free to drop some reactions in the chat. Are there folks who you love, folks who you admire? If there's anyone here who you do not recognize, feel free to drop that in the chat as well. But I think that, as we start thinking about personal branding, this is a great way to sort of segue and pivot into talking a little bit more about what it means to actually build out a personal brand per se. Right. A couple of questions about the person on the left. So that is Sarah Blakely, who is the founder of Spanx. So certainly, yes, people of influence, and you do have folks covering every sort of realm from entertainment through government. I think, I think the two folks on the bottom are always very interesting ones. Jose Andres, who really made his name and built his reputation, and I would say his sort of first personal brand, is being an incredibly talented chef in the fine dining world. But it's interesting, if you talk to more and more folks these days, I think more people recognize him for the philanthropic work he's done through his charity, World Central Kitchen, going into all sorts of places, whether it be Ukraine or Afghanistan or Africa, or wherever there is hardship, and providing meals to people who have either been displaced or who are experiencing hardship. That secondary brand that he has built, I think in many ways has been not really a natural evolution of his first initial brand, but really I think in many ways has overtaken that first brand. For folks who are looking at Rihanna, I think it's always interesting. She's a fabulous case study in what it means to build a brand. A lot of folks don't realize that music is not actually what made her a billionaire. It was the beauty brands that she is behind that did. And while she is the richest female musician, she also just happens to be the second richest female entertainer, only behind Oprah. And so when you think about all of the things that Rihanna has done, all of the products, services that she has touched, again, she has, I think, done an exceptional job of building a brand that really encompasses a lot of different things and touches a lot of different industries, but has really done so in a way that has created quite a sphere of influence around her. And then finally, I think Jacinda Ardern, the former prime minister from New Zealand, is another fascinating individual. Again, coming from the world of politics, just like Zelensky here. Again, both of them had previous and had other careers before they moved into politics. I think Zelensky is probably might even be more interesting with his career in comedy and in media as an actor before becoming president of Ukraine. But again, as you think about some of these natural evolutions, or maybe even some of these unnatural evolutions, I would encourage you to think about yourselves. And obviously, I think our personal swings are probably not quite as significant, but as you do think about how you've evolved and how your story has changed, your brand has changed, it is important to start thinking about what are some of those breadcrumbs, what are some of those key milestones that were pivotal and instrumental along the way as you developed and continue to evolve, because all of those things are going to be incredibly important as you start thinking about how are you telling that story in your business school applications. My goodness. Here we go. All right, so let's talk now a little bit about what goes into actually building a personal brand. So when I go through this exercise with clients, we start with some very basic foundational things, and we talk at its core, a brand is going to be comprised of three things when it comes to personal branding: expertise, purpose, and authenticity. And so we'll start with expertise. And expertise, most of you are probably thinking, these are going to be technical skills. These are going to be things that you are really good at. Maybe you were an engineering major in college or studied computer science, so maybe programming is an area of expertise. Maybe your superpower is in branding and storytelling, or maybe it's in finance or wealth management. What I think is really important to be mindful of is you start thinking about your areas of expertise. Think about how they align with who you are as a person, because as you can see here, what I always remind folks is that you are so much more, in fact, than just a talent or a skill. I might be dating myself. I realize as I give this presentation every year, there are fewer and fewer people where this reference lands well. But if any of you have seen The Breakfast Club, the wonderful movie from the 80s, you might recall that every character in that movie sort of had a tagline or had a brand, whether you were the jock or the brains or the prom queen, the princess, essentially. I think it's very easy to attach a label to ourselves. Things, basically, and tether those things to things that we know to be true around things that we're good at, or things that people have told us that we just happen to be very good at. But don't box yourself in. My biggest piece of advice to you here is you start thinking about business schools. You start thinking about what are those strengths and superpowers you're going to be talking about. Don't just limit yourself to the things that people have told you that you're very good at, or the things that you you fall back on or go to because you know that they happen to be strengths. When you think about areas of expertise, start thinking a little bit more creatively. And I will tell you, for a lot of folks, I do a lot of work in the high school space as well too. And the example that I share with a lot of folks is that, at Harvard in 2022, there were 4,000 high school valedictorians who applied to Harvard for 2,000 spots. For those 4,000 valedictorians, they probably all thought that that was their area of expertise, that they were absolutely the cream of the crop, the top of their class. For folks who are applying to business school, I think the same can hold true, because obviously you're hearing all sorts of things about how schools want to see, great undergraduate grades. They want to see performance at work, results, impact. Have you been promoted? How have you grown and evolved? So yes, these are all certainly things that are going to be important. And as you start thinking about how to build out that narrative, but just make sure as you're thinking about your areas of expertise, the things that you're good at, um, don't necessarily back yourself into a corner where you are tying yourself to just one or two things, because chances are the population applying to business school with you is going to be saturated with folks who are on paper are very, very similar to yourself. So spend some time thinking a little bit more creatively about what it means to be an expert at something. And that segues very nicely into this next idea of purpose. And so, purpose really is, this is always the litmus test that I use with folks. I ask them, like, at the end of the day, what gets you out of bed in the morning? I know most folks applying to business school are overcommitted, they're overscheduled, they're top performers. Very rarely do you have the luxury of having a true off day. And so I would challenge you to think about this. Ask yourself, if you had an off day, if you had a day where, let's say, Slack was down, all the cell networks are down, everything's down, you have zero responsibility when it comes to work or anything else. What would you do then? Like, how would you choose to spend that day? What is going to get you out of bed that morning? And I would start thinking about what are some of those things right now? And then also take a look, spend some time introspectively and think a little bit about what were some of the things that gave you purpose when you were applying to your undergrad program, when you were applying to that first job. How has that sense of purpose evolved and shifted over the years? And probably more importantly, as you start thinking about business school and you start thinking about what you're going to be talking about in those applications, how does that sense of purpose now guide what you're going to do with that MBA and beyond? Because that, in so many ways, is the most important and most critical part of those applications, is being able to articulate what are you going to actually do with that MBA once you graduate? What does the future hold for you? And then finally, the third part here is this idea of authenticity. And so asking yourself, what makes you authentically you? And again, this trifecta here of expertise, purpose, and authenticity, this is really what goes into building or defining what a personal brand is for an individual. If you're having trouble thinking about sort of what makes you authentic, I would encourage you to think a little bit about if you were to talk about yourself to someone. What are the things, or if you were to introduce yourself, if you're going to an interview, what are the things that this person's already going to know about you based off of your resume and based off of your LinkedIn profile? And then think about the things that are not included in those documents or on those sites. That is going to start giving you a better sense of sort of at your core what actually makes you you, because so much of this these are the intangibles that we're talking about. These are the things that are much harder to articulate because you need to figure out how does this manifest in various parts of your life. And so again, it's this combination of expertise, authenticity, and purpose that really is going to start building sort of those differentiators out as you think about how this is all going to manifest in your application itself. All right, so let's talk a little bit about breaking down what a personal brand looks like. So I've broken it down into sort of five sections. And again, this is based on a lot of the work that I've done with clients over the years. And we go through this exercise to really sort of define and sort of articulate what do each of these pillars sort of look like. And so we'll run through these kind of quickly this evening. But I think a lot of these questions, a lot of these bullets here will certainly help you as you're thinking about this for yourself. So number one, you've got to start with purpose. And so thinking about what is your end goal? And I'm going to tell you right now, your end goal is not just to get an MBA. It's thinking beyond that. Again, it kind of goes back to what I was just mentioning around, it's thinking about what are you going to be doing with that MBA? How are you going off and changing the world? Because at the end of the day, this is what schools are looking for. They want to understand, yes, like you could go out and have your choice of any MBA at this point. And honestly, at this point, there are so many other iterations of the MBA, whether it's online, or a variety of other different program types that are out there. You've got plenty of choices. So why this particular MBA? And so thinking about what is that end goal that you're ultimately trying to achieve, and how does the MBA fit into that end goal? How does it fit into that process? I do think it's important to recognize that you can have more than one goal. And honestly, I think for many folks, it's actually really helpful to be able to articulate what some of those key milestones are and what some of those sub goals are in order to get to that ultimate end goal. And what I would start doing is I would start by sitting down and actually writing all this out and building out a timeline and assigning yourself just sort of rough timetables. So that way you're able to start thinking about, and how are you mapping this out, number one. But number two, how are you setting yourself up for success, and where specifically does business school fit into this equation and into this timetable? Next is this idea of competition. And this probably sounds pretty basic. I mean, most folks are probably sitting here thinking about, well, I'm competing against everybody else who's applying to Harvard Business School or to Wharton. And yes, that's absolutely true. But I think as you're thinking about competition, there are a couple of different ways to slice and dice competition. So number one, yes, you are competing against every single person who's applying to that institution, but you're also competing in other pools as well. So if you are an engineer, if you are an entrepreneur, if you are in finance, if you are in management consulting, you have a much smaller slice sort of the pie that you are going to be competing against as well. And so thinking about, how do you stand out? How do you differentiate yourself from, again, all of the folks who have similar backgrounds on paper? So again, what we just talked about, all those different areas of expertise, you're probably going to have some overlap with individuals. And so it's really important to think about, how are you defining who that competitive set is? What are the things that they are going to be good at? Because chances are those are probably things that you're fairly good at as well. And then starting to think about, what are the things that you are better at? So what differentiates you from your competition? If you are in management consulting, but maybe you are a liberal arts major and had an interesting sort of path to get to management consulting, that is certainly something to explore and to think about the pathway that you took to get there. If you are in finance, or if you're in wealth management, but maybe you dabbled in corporate finance first, or M&A, again, thinking about what are the different experiences that you've curated for yourself to ultimately get to where you are now, and then how is that going to impact you moving forward? So again, as you think about your competitive set, think really critically and think very broadly about who is in that competitive set, and start thinking about how you're going to be able to find those differentiators. Next, when we think about audience, so again, I think for a lot of folks that, again, the knee-jerk reaction here is, well, the audience is going to be the admissions committee. And yes, that absolutely is the case. Your primary audience for a business school application is going to be the admissions committee reading your application. But you also want to think about some of the other audiences that you have as well. As you think about various aspects of your application, you're going to be sharing parts of yourself with different people. And so think about the interview, think about the types of individuals who are conducting the interviews, whether it be university employees, whether it be alumni, whether it be current students. Also think about the folks writing your letters of recommendation, because part of that, and I think this is one of the most overlooked things that I see when working with folks, is that folks just assume they can ask someone to write a letter of recommendation, give them a copy of their resume, and then just send them off to the races. It's really important to remember that the folks writing your letters are also another audience for you. And so you need to make sure that you're taking advantage of the fact that you have someone talking about you from a different perspective. You want them to be able to talk about different aspects of who you are, what makes you uniquely you, and more importantly, be able to back it up with examples. It's also really important to think about, what are the big drivers for every single person who is in that audience category. So what is important to them and to their organization? For the admissions committee, obviously, they want to make sure that they're putting together a very well-rounded cohort that is going to espouse and really embrace the values of that institution and that program and take it to the next level. As you think about what that actually means, though, for you, this is where you start thinking about this idea of product market fit. So how does the product that you are building, align and fit with what the marketplace is basically offering up? And so thinking very critically about, again, how do you align on a school by school basis with what the school is looking for is going to be incredibly important, and thinking about that audience. Next up is this idea of a mission statement, more commonly referred to probably as an elevator pitch. And I'm sure many of you have already drafted things like this as you've gone on to interview at companies. One of the things that I encourage folks to think about is, your mission statement and your elevator pitch for business school are going to be very different than the elevator pitch you have used to land jobs, primarily because the outcome is going to be very different. The intended outcome is very different. And also because you're going to want the person on the other end to remember different things about you. And so again, you're tailoring this based on your audience. And so think about what are the things that are important to you and what are the 2 or 3 things that you would want someone to remember about you coming out of a conversation. These are going to be some of the big drivers that you think about using as sort of the foundation of your personal statement. And then finally, this idea of brand voice. So thinking about how do you want to be perceived? And this can be tough because I think a lot of times folks are thinking that, you know, in order to fit with a particular school or program, you need to tell them what they want to hear. And so what I would encourage you to think about here is, again, authenticity is going to be incredibly important. You want to make sure that in your attempts and in your efforts to come across as authentic and to convey fit, you're not losing your unique voice and you're not trying to be or pass yourself off as something that you aren't necessarily. It is a tough balance for a lot of folks to figure out how to get that balance right. But I promise you, as someone who has read thousands of applications, the folks reading your applications have been doing this for a long time. They have been trained. They understand this, what goes into this really well. And so because of all that, they're going to be able to tell they'll be able to sniff out authenticity or lack thereof. And so it's really important as you think about what is your brand voice? How do you want people to perceive you, that you are remaining true to your authentic self here and not inventing a new version or iteration of yourself for the purpose of your application. For folks who are having trouble drafting kind of a personal brand statement, and this really for a lot of folks, for a lot of the folks that I work with, this really is sort of the precursor or the sort of the pre-exercise that we work on right before we start drafting personal statements. If you're having trouble thinking about this, I think sometimes it's great to start outsourcing a little bit of this and talking to folks around you. So if you've got a core circle of folks, friends, family, who you trust, coworkers, some of these are great questions to tee up with them to get a much broader, more comprehensive 360 view of sort of who you are as a person, but also how people perceive you. And so some of these things, you know, asking folks like, how would you describe me as a team member or as a leader? You know, what are your superpowers? What are you incredibly good at? And then even asking, you know, yourself, like what do you actually celebrate about yourself? Because I find for a lot of folks that the things that people talk about that they're very good at are oftentimes not the things that bring them the most joy, or the things that they're most passionate about. And so thinking about the delta potentially, if there is one between those things, is going to be incredibly important. And then thinking about how that ladders up and rolls into what you're thinking about in terms of your future goals and aspirations, because that will certainly manifest itself in your application. The last question on this slide I really enjoy. It's this idea of asking folks, you know, at the end of the day, you know, again, for most of these programs, you are going to be in a fairly small cohort or a smaller group. And so the sort of the litmus test here is, you know, would you want to be in my class? Or maybe even better yet, like, am I someone whose roommate you would want to be? And thinking about what are the traits, what are the qualities that you would want in a cohort mate, for example. And thinking about how do you address some of those, again, very aggressively in your application is going to be very important. So these are definitely some great starter questions to start off thinking about as you start thinking about not only your personal statements, but again, this idea of building sort of that personal brand, that elevator pitch, that framework document from which everything else in your application is going to come. I did want to touch just briefly on a couple of things with regards to admissions and just the level of competition and particularly the impact of COVID and questions around testing, because these are questions that we get quite a bit. You know, I think the biggest impact with COVID honestly had to do with testing and the fact that most schools went test optional. And while many schools have returned to either requiring or heavily recommending testing, there are still a handful of schools that are test optional or that are very liberal with their waiver policy. You know, what I would encourage you to do, especially if you are planning for round one right now for 2025, the good news is that your runway is still fairly long. And so I would encourage you, if you are thinking about testing, take the time to sit down and take a practice GMAT focus or a GRE, or even potentially think about the EA if you can as well. But I think probably more importantly, or for most folks, it's really going to come down to GMAT focus or the GRE. Think about what your strengths are. The GMAT focus quant section is typically regarded as a more challenging quantitative section than the GRE quant section. So think about, again, play to your strengths. If quant is not your thing, it might be worth exploring the GRE. You want to ultimately end up picking the exam that's going to help best position you for success. And certainly you can take a look at all of the reported averages that schools, that schools report when it comes to both of these exams. And I usually encourage folks, again, if you have the luxury of time, take a practice test for each of these, spend the time, think about which test plays to your strengths, and then look at carving out anywhere from 3 to 4 months to actually sit down and do some dedicated prep as well here. One of the other questions that I often receive as well kind of comes down to this idea of, what's better? Is it better to be well-rounded and have a lot of sort of broad experience and diverse experiences, or is it better to be a specialist? And, and I think for business school, obviously most of you are on a very specific career track. And so I think for by and large, most folks have chosen to specialize at this point. But I do think when you start thinking about extracurricular activities, when you think about community outreach, volunteer work, things like that, it is helpful to show that you have other diverse interests and you're well-rounded. I find this to be especially true with a lot of the engineers that I work with. I think it's really important to be able to show schools that, again, number one, you have interests outside of your core, sort of outside of your core area of focus. But more importantly, if you have followed a very rigid academic pathway throughout most of your career, it's really important to be able to show schools that you, number one, not only do you have diverse interests, but number two, that you are able to execute at a high level across some of these other subject areas. And then last but not least, this idea of overrepresented profiles, and I alluded a little bit to this earlier. The idea of the fact that when you are applying to schools, you will more likely than not be compared to people or compared against folks who have similar profiles to you as well. And so if you are coming from an industry that has no shortage of applicants, so finance, management, consulting, to name a few, definitely think about, again, what are some of the activities, what are some of the experiences that you've curated for yourself? Think about impact specifically in the roles that you have had and how you can, again, differentiate yourself from all of that competition, from all of that white noise that you're going to be encountering as well. I wanted to touch just for a minute here on the idea of just sort of fit and holistic admissions. And when you talk to schools, most schools employ what they call a holistic approach to admissions. And what that really means is that they are approaching admissions from a very comprehensive perspective. They're looking at people from a 360 perspective and are really diving into every aspect of a person's profile. What does that mean? That means we're talking about professional experience. And so we want quality over quantity. One of the big questions that I receive is usually has to do with years of work experience. And the fact of the matter is, the reason that schools have reported averages around years of work experience is because they recognize the value that genuine experience brings to the table. Someone who is fresh out of school is not going to have the breadth of experience, the life stories, the real world experience and hands-on learning that someone with 3, 4, 5 years of work experience is going to have. The value that they bring to those classroom conversations is just going to be incredibly different. And so it is really important to think about the quality of your experience first over the quantity of experience, but also if you are kind of teetering on the cusp, and again, this is a conversation I have quite a bit, really thinking about why the rush. If you are thinking about business school and you're on the edge with maybe like a year and a half or 2 years of experience, I think it's really important to spend some time thinking about why business school, why now? And would you potentially benefit from an additional year of experience before actually casting a wider net for admissions? The secondary here is academics. And so thinking about, obviously your undergraduate GPA is something that you can't change. But if there are potential blemishes on in your undergraduate experience, thinking about what can you do to help make up for that. And what I mean by that is thinking about what are some of the other things you can do, again, because of this idea of holistic admissions, to help a school have the confidence that you are going to be able to handle the rigor of a full-time program. And that can be potentially additional coursework that can certainly come in the shape or form of your standardized test score. So in this case, sometimes the GMAT and the GRE is going to be even more important. But again, more importantly, whatever you can do to provide additional data points to a school, to give them that confidence that you have the maturity, that you have the capacity to be successful in the classroom is going to be of the utmost importance here. Positive character attributes and soft skills. So this is touched on quite a bit in letters of recommendation, but this is also something that you'll want to figure out how to address in your application, in your personal statement in particular. There's very much this idea, I would say, of sort of showing, not telling. So you don't want to come out and tell school that, hey, I'm a really great leader, but it's a lot better to be able to show how have you demonstrated leadership at work? Have you, have you been in a position where you've been able to manage a team? Have you had to exert influence when you haven't necessarily had responsibility or authority? How have you demonstrated leadership outside of work? Have you taken initiative to seek out opportunities and activities that give you that type of experience and exposure? So anything you can do to think about, again, how have you sort of grown, evolved? How have you developed some of these positive character attributes? How have you grown and developed some of these soft skills since graduating from college? This is going to be incredibly important. This is also a great place in your letter of recommendation to have folks who are writing those letters address these things head on and talk directly about them through specific examples and storytelling. One of the things I recommend to clients is that you think about your application very much like a jigsaw puzzle. So every piece of your application is serving a purpose, and that there is just enough overlap so that the person looking at your application recognizes that you in fact are the same person that is being talked about in letters of recommendation as is the person who's actually applying, but that there's not so much overlap that your application feels redundant. And that is a very delicate balance to achieve. But the folks who do it well, I think, really do make the most out of that limited real estate on the application itself. We've talked a little bit about test scores. We've talked a little bit about extracurriculars. What I would encourage you to think about with regards to extracurriculars, and especially if you are gearing up to apply over the next 6 to 9 months, if you are light on extracurricular activities, this is not the time to go out and add a bunch of new activities to your resume. I would try to pick at least one meaningful thing that you can commit to in a reasonable way over the next 6 to 9 months. It's more about demonstrating to a school that you care about things outside of your core job. What this really is a microcosm for is it allows schools to really see what type of contributing community member you're going to be when you get onto their campus. So are you someone who cares about leaving the community or leaving the university campus and community a bit better than you found it? Are you going to get involved? Are you going to be, or are you going to be that person who goes to class, clocks in, clocks out, goes to the library and just sort of does the bare minimum and treats it as a checklist? Schools really want to see that individuals are coming to genuinely get involved within the larger community. And so that's really the purpose in many ways of extracurriculars and community service here. And then finally, when we talk about having a distinct point of view, this is something that will start to manifest and start to come out as you go through sort of these personal branding exercises, as you start taking stock and inventory of the experiences that you've curated for yourself, but also the things that are incredibly important to you. But making sure that you really start developing what that unique perspective and point of view is, and then making sure that that thread is evenly woven through every aspect of your application. So is it obvious in your resume? Is it obvious in your essays, in your interviews that you're conducting? Just making sure that every piece of your application is going to be sort of touched by that particular perspective that you have, because again, that is going to help reiterate to the school that you truly do mean what you say and that you truly have thought this through and do have a plan for yourself. And then last but not least, this idea of alignment with the school's mission and values. And so, as I had mentioned before, this is in many ways, it feels very much like a very traditional exercise in product market fit, but making sure that you take the time to look and see what is important to a school when they articulate that, whether it be through their mission statements. I think, I tell folks all the time, one of the best places you can start when you're trying to think about what schools are looking for is go to their website, go to their mission statement, and they will spell it out for you exactly. They will tell you exactly what is important to them. One of the examples that I'll use sometimes with folks is if you look at a school like Georgetown, a very traditional Jesuit institution that leads with this idea of being men and women for others, this notion of cura personalis. There is such a deep connection to service, philanthropy, just this idea of sort of restless inquiry and questioning. And then you compare it to a school like Columbia, which in their mission statement, I think it might even be within the first sentence, they lead with the fact that they are an academic center of excellence. They focus heavily on research. And so again, it is very much aligned with this idea that academics are first and foremost at an institution like that. And so I do think it's important when folks are looking at schools and doing their due diligence, you can learn a lot about a school by looking at how they talk about what is important to them. And if you are able to sort of see yourself aligning with that, I think that certainly is going to give you some signal in terms of how you want to position yourself and how you want to talk about yourself and your interests in your application itself. Last but not least, as I mentioned, so Target Test Prep does offer a variety of admissions consulting services. Our primary product line here are the school packages. These come in a series of basically essentially 1 to 7 schools. And what this really means is that you are working with a consultant, someone who has direct admissions experience on every aspect of your application. So whether it be, if you're in the early stages, it's everything from school selection, school strategy, talking about how you handle school visits and demonstrate interest, who are the folks you should be meeting with, what are the questions you should be asking, but really a very high touch level of service, and really, I would say, an advocate and an ambassador who can walk you through every single step of the process. For folks who are looking for much more specific or targeted prep, we do offer hourly consulting as well. And that can be anything from help with idea, sort of brainstorming or essay ideation, to essay proofreading, interview preparation, you name it. And then finally, we have our a la carte services, as you can see here. Everything from a full review of your application package. For anyone who's looking at round 3 right now, this could be a great option or opportunity just to have someone take a full review of everything you're planning on submitting and provide feedback before you do, to things like pre-application strategies. So if you're maybe thinking about business school in 2026 or 27 and want to get a little bit of guidance on things you can do to strengthen your profile now, those could be great options for you as well. And then we do also offer what we call our mentorship bundle, which is an opportunity to work with someone like myself who has a variety of different industry experiences to do some executive coaching over an extended period of time. And as a thank you, we did want to mention that we do have a promo code this month for a 10% off discount off of all of our school packages. And so the code here on the slide here will be good for that. And you'll also receive that in an email after tonight as well. Great. And so with that, I will pause. I think we've got about 10 minutes left for Q&A. So I'm going to take a look over at the chat and see if there are any other questions that folks have. And again, I do see some of these messages here about about direct messaging only working. So apologies again for that this evening. All right. So going back to the beginning, it looks like we had a question about sort of what makes for a good personal statement. I'll be honest, I think we could probably do an entire webinar on personal statements, but I think that at a very high level, a good personal statement is going to accomplish a couple of things. It's number one, it's going to tell part of your story. Again, this is where you have the opportunity to differentiate yourself and stand out from the crowd. Everyone's story is going to be unique. And what you want to do in a good personal statement is make sure that you're telling the most important aspects of that story and anchoring them to how you have grown, the professional journey that you've taken, what you have done, and then more importantly, what you want to do in the future. So again, all of this it's important to ladder all of this up to a place where you feel like you are, where you really feel like you're able to kind of pull everything sort of full circle and articulate, again, not only everything that you've done, everything that you want to do, but how, more importantly, an MBA is going to help you. And I would actually go even one step further than that and say how an MBA from that particular institution is going to help you achieve those goals and why they're uniquely positioned to be, to sort of help you in the next phase of your career. Great questions here about the number of schools that you should be applying to. So I think it's fair to say that number is going to vary for everyone. But what I would encourage you to do is think about, when you think about the rounds, I would encourage you to prioritize and rank stack the schools that are your top choices in the earlier rounds. For many schools, round 1 and round 2 are ambivalent. It doesn't matter which round you apply to. But for many schools, though, it's good to sort of have first movers advantage. Round 1 is going to be, it's the admissions committee's first chance to take a look at the population of applicants. If they happen to be overwhelmed with a number of high quality applicants, for example, from your particular industry, and let's say they do take a handful during round 1, you may potentially be at a disadvantage going into round 2 because they've already maybe filled a quota or hit a certain number of folks who have similar profiles. So I would encourage you, as you think about sort of which of the schools that you are targeting and which are your top choices, to certainly prioritize those in the earlier rounds. But in terms of the total number of schools, I've worked with folks who will apply to as few as 1 or 2 schools because they have very specific goals and they have very specific and targeted goals that are going to align with just a very small handful of schools. for a variety of reasons. And so I would encourage you to think about, again, are your goals tethered to a specific school for a specific reason? Or are you really just looking to get the best possible MBA you can from the best possible school? And so in that case, potentially your net may be a little bit wider as well. So it's certainly something to think about. What I will tell you is if you are looking at top 25 programs, though, I would encourage you to make sure that you're spending a sufficient amount of time on each of those applications. These schools are so competitive, and you don't have the luxury of having a very large margin of error for these applications. And so if you are talking about tackling 7 or 8 applications for round 1, you better make sure that you have a very good plan for how you're going to actually complete all of those applications at a very, very high level in order to meet those deadlines. Every year I work with folks who start off with very lofty expectations and goals in terms of how many applications they're planning on submitting round 1. And ultimately, some point over the summer, we do have to have a conversation around, does it make sense to bump some of these to round 2 to make sure that you're able to put forth the very best possible product for those deadlines? And so that is something you'll want to spend some time thinking about. All right, so we have a question about, is it better to pitch a story of wanting to go to business school to level up in your current industry or pivot if you're not sure? So I will say that it's a very specific and sort of personal choice. But what I would say is that if you are looking to pivot, I think it's very important to be very clear that you are looking to pivot out of your current career. Even if you're not 100% sure what you want to do, you want to be able to articulate at least what are some of the pathways or options that you are thinking about, because it's more important for the school to understand the motivation behind the pivot and what you're looking to actually do with the MBA. It's going to be a lot harder for a business school to place you in an industry that is to be determined, or if you don't have a good sense of what, of at least a couple types of roles or industries that you would want to land in. And so as much information as you can give the school is going to be helpful for them. But again, I think more importantly, it's important for the school to see that you're not using business school as an escape hatch or as an exit strategy, that you're using it very strategically to help you pivot to do something very specific. And so again, the other thing I would just mention here is you're certainly not being held to anything that you write about specifically in your application. So it's not like you're going to be accepted to a school and then on day 1, career services is going to have your essay. And if you tell them that you want to do pivot into management consulting, they're not going to say, well, you told us you actually wanted to do something different. You can absolutely pivot and change your mind once you get there. But again, schools want to understand that and genuinely believe that you've gone through the strategic exercise of thinking through what's the pathway for you coming out of business school. Let's see. So GMAT aside or testing aside, how many months is sufficient for crafting and finalizing an application? So for most folks, it's about a 4 to 6 month process. I will tell you, I've worked with clients who've been able to do it faster. I've worked with folks who have needed more time. Honestly, a lot of the work that I do, especially at this time of year, as I start to work with round 1 clients, is a lot of this brainstorming work on defining a personal brand, talking about what the MBA is going to be used for, what types of roles, what types of industries you're going to land in. For folks who are what we would call career shifters or looking to pivot, we spend a lot of time talking about what are the possibilities. So again, going through that creative exercise and that difficult exercise, quite frankly, of thinking about how are you going to use the MBA to pivot into the next phase of your career? Because again, it is far better to do that work and to be able to articulate that clearly and succinctly in your application and in your interviews than trying to figure it out and just sort of fumble your way through it. It is, what I always tell folks is, because I do a good bit of work with high school students as well, it is perfectly fine to be undecided or undeclared when you are 16 or 17 years old applying to college. By the time you're applying to business school, though, you have spent time in the professional world. You are expected to be a little bit more developed in terms of where your thinking is and in terms of what you're looking to go after. So a lot of the work, like I said, with clients these days, especially early on in the process, is dedicated to this idea of sort of personal reflection, introspection, but really spending a lot of time kind of asking some of those tough questions and mapping out what the future might look like. So, but I think that's a very long-winded answer to your question. But I think 4 to 6 months is probably a decent time frame. But knowing that there obviously are cases on both ends of the bell curve as well. Some questions. So there are some questions here about how do you handle certain extenuating circumstances and I'm kind of lumping some of these questions all together. What I would say is, the most important thing on an application is you do want to be completely honest. And I encourage candidates all the time. If there's something questionable in your history, whether it be academic, extracurricular, whatever it may be, it is in your best interest to be transparent and to be honest about it and address it aggressively in your application. It is far worse to have a school discover something about you and then come back to you and ask you about it. Than the converse. So I would encourage you, if there is something in your profile, in your background, that maybe is a little delicate or sensitive, and I'll be really candid with you, I think this is a great opportunity to work with a consultant who can help you position that particular, whatever that situation or scenario may be. Again, everyone is going to be very different, but you are going to want to think about how you position that as part of your larger narrative. See, I'm going through a couple of other questions here. Differences in the various rounds as well. So we have a couple of these questions, it looks like. So every school is going to be a little bit different in terms of the number of rounds and in terms of, like I said, the likelihood of admissions. Some schools are going to split it up 50-50. So for example, HBS splits it up pretty evenly across rounds. Other schools do not. And so I think it is important for that to certainly be part of your due diligence. But what I would encourage you, again, is you're starting to build out timelines for yourselves. Definitely err on the side of trying to be a bit more aggressive in terms of hitting those earlier deadlines, but then make sure that you're building in checkpoints, especially 30 days out, to really take stock of where you are with your applications. As I mentioned, it is far better to submit fewer applications, but ensure that they are excellent, and that they are, a 98 or a 99% solution, as opposed to trying to submit 7, 8, 9 applications that are maybe at 80%. It really does make a difference, and it does matter, especially for given the caliber of programs that most folks are planning on applying to. We have questions about recommendations or alumni and connections and networking. I think that what I would encourage you to just think about is as you go through this process. It certainly helps if you're able to engage with as many students, alumni as possible, to learn as much as you can about the program, about the institution. In terms of legacy or having sort of one-ups, it is very much school dependent, the role that having an alumni connection or a family connection is going to play. And so I would encourage you, I wouldn't get too hung up on the minutia around that, but what I would encourage you to do is start thinking about, as you are looking to educate yourself a little bit more so on programs, do start tapping into your own networks to try to find as many folks as you can who do have firsthand knowledge, who are familiar and experienced with some of these schools, because that is a great way to start gathering intelligence and to start really just up-leveling your knowledge in general about many of these programs. We have some questions about deferred admission programs, so 2+2, and that is a great question. There's a very, very different strategy for 2+2 or for deferred admission programs, because again, obviously schools are looking at, and these are, for those who are not familiar, these are programs that undergrads apply to, so that they can land, basically secure a spot and then go off and work for some time before coming back. Admissions committees are going to look at these applicants very, very differently. They're obviously not going to be comparing them in the same pool or in the same way to someone who does have years of work experience. In this case, it's really going to be important to talk about any type of experience that you do have, whether that's through internships, extracurriculars. I think there's a much heavier emphasis certainly on soft skills and skills you've been able to develop. Again, it's important to leverage the experiences that you do have, to look at the results, look at the impacts you've been able to drive in your internships, in whatever roles you have held. And again, more importantly, when you think about extracurriculars that you've been involved with, there are certainly ways to demonstrate impact in a variety of different ways. It's just a matter of taking an inventory of what you have done and then thinking about the best way to sort of organize that in your application. I have questions. There's some questions here about about GPA and sort of formulas, like if you have a good GPA, but if you have this or you don't have this. So I'm going to try to lump some of these into just a broader question. This will probably be the last one of the evening. what I would encourage you to think about is, just number one, there is no set formula for admission. I think that's probably the biggest takeaway or the biggest message I can give you to take away from here this evening is that there's no magic formula when it comes to admission. And frankly, if there was, someone would have figured out how to bottle it up and sell it, and frankly, everyone would be getting into all of the schools that they apply to. So there's no magic formula to say you need to have a 3.7 undergraduate GPA in one of these areas with a certain test score. As I mentioned before, most schools are employing what they call a holistic approach to admissions. And so they really are looking at individuals as just that, complete people, whole individuals. And so when you do think about some of those data points on your profile, certainly if there are blemishes in your profile, if your undergrad GPA is a little bit far from stellar, it's important to think about what else can you do that is within your span of control now to try to make up for some of that. Again, if your undergrad GPA is not great, certainly a strong test score can start and help to make up for some of that. There's not a perfect one-for-one trade-off by any means. It's a question that I get all the time from folks because there isn't an exact corollary to what you need. But it is really important then to be able to show that, maybe if undergrad was not as successful, what have you then done in your professional life? How have you been able to flex some of these skills, build some of these technical skills? But more importantly, again, what results have you been able to drive in the roles that you've been able to hold? Have you been promoted? Have you grown? Again, being able to show that you have been able to be successful in a variety of different roles is going to be far more important than especially, looking back 3, 4, 5 years at what you did when you were, say an 18 or a 19-year-old. This is also, now I will say, if there is something in your undergrad experience that you do want to aggressively address, perhaps a poor performance, there is space on the application to do so. And I do encourage folks, if there is something that really does stand out, to take that opportunity to talk about it and to address it head on. Again, it's far better to own that narrative and to own that conversation than to have someone come back to you in an interview or after the fact and start asking questions about something that doesn't seem to quite add up. So I do apologize that we won't be able to get to every single question. I see a couple of other really great ones here. And I think just the last thing that I'll mention here too is that you do not need to submit anything pre-college as well on your application. But if you do have additional questions, what I would encourage you to do is do feel free to visit our website, Target Test Prep. And you can actually sign up to request a free 15-minute consultation, and you can bring all of these questions to your consultation as well. So I do want to just say thank you again to everyone for joining us this afternoon, this evening, this morning, wherever you might be dialing in from. And I wish you all the best of luck, though, as you tackle your applications, whether it is at the tail end of the cycle for you or if you're just getting started. So thank you so much for joining us. And again, I wish you all the best. Thank you.